Season 2, Episode 10.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to UX Podcast, coming to you from Stockholm, Sweden. We are your hosts, Pat Axbom
and James Royal Lawson.
Balancing business, technology, people, and society with listeners all over the world, from the Cayman Islands to Moldova.
David Dylan Thomas. He's an author, speaker, podcast host, UXer, content strategist, and also previous guest on UX Podcast.
And in today's chat with David, we discuss ownership, both physical and digital. We get into the importance of paying attention to power balances and applying a social justice lens when working with design. I especially love his idea that comes up in the interview of moving towards a design framing of build, measure, learn, and give back. Today's interview was recorded at the UX conference From Business to Buttons right here in Stockholm. The 2024 edition of the conference will take place on May 24th, and the theme is movement. It invites you as a changemaker to join the movement of working for justice and sustainability in a world facing a number of complex challenges. Read more about the theme and speakers such as Cheryl Kababa, Christina Joy Whitaker, Chris Nossel, Lou Down, and more on FromBusinessToButtons.com. And for 10% off the ticket price, use the promo code UXPodcast.
So, David, when you're talking about turning conflict into collaboration and finding a place to meet, to bring out the best for those kind of conversations, one of the elements you mention is like things like you haven't considered. It's like I haven't considered that idea.
Yeah.
It's like I know that you've been talking in your stay so far in Stockholm, Sweden, about the concept of ownership.
Yeah.
And this has also brought up something that you hadn't considered earlier.
Yeah, I'm an American, and in America, we have very clear definitions of ownership, right? I own this. Everything is owned by somebody. And if that person owns it, they can do whatever they want with it. They can buy it, they can sell it, they can do whatever they want. And if anyone wants to do anything with that, they have to get permission. And it being American capitalism, ideally, I charge you for access to the thing that I own.
And a contract that's kind of like got to be checked by several lawyers that also cost you God knows how much to take you through.
And the legal aspect is really interesting, but the legal language usually is very strict. And I've been thinking a lot about ownership lately and what it looks like to think outside of ownership, because I've been learning more about Native American and other indigenous traditions, that some of which don't necessarily have a concept of ownership, right? It's like, those aren't my strawberries, those aren't your strawberries, they're just strawberries. They belong to themselves, which, again, from my upbringing in an American capitalist system, is anathema. Like, what are you talking about? Somebody has to own them. Somebody has to sell them. So that already, like that kind of mind lock of ownership is this binary thing. In talking with a friend of mine, Johan Brunson, yesterday, he was telling me about how in Sweden, there is this concept of you can own property and yet be obligated to let people use it. So if I own property, if someone wants to go camping, they can. And that just blew my mind. This notion of like, a complicated, like a liminal ownership, where it's like, okay, you own it, but you also have to let people use it, which brings in, I think, an element of that Native American, the land doesn't really belong to anybody. I mean, yeah, you quote unquote own it, but also we all get to share it. Like introducing that legally, even, I haven't had a chance to read it, but he sent me the actual legal statute. Having legal language even to describe that just blows my mind. And yes, I had not considered a non-binary approach to ownership before, so that's definitely falls into that category.
Yeah. The shared that particular law in Sweden is a really interesting one, and it's one of those things you pick up reasonably quickly when
it's literally called every person's right, allemans rätt.
Yeah. And it does, of course, come with a little star.
Sure.
It's not just a free for all, and that you can you wake up in the morning as a third person in your bed. And you're going, what the hell? It doesn't quite. I mean, it's not quite as liberal as that. But yeah, I mean, I can't remember all the details, but one of them is like you can't camp too close to someone's property.
It was too close to the house, to the main house.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that means, I have a property where I have calculated that by extension, people can actually camp on my property without me being able to say no. Also, if people they can essentially cross my lawn and stuff like that. It's no problem because of the way I live close to water.
It's interesting. So in America, we have this phrase, get off my lawn, which is
Yes,
sort of
exactly.
like,
Yes.
and it's like literally not an option. It's like, no, get on my lawn. Go ahead.
But it is a fascinating concept, the whole thing of ownership, because even when, I think here in Sweden, at least to that extent, that there's not the full ownership maybe or over the rights to use and utilise that bit of land, there's always ownership of something. And here, I know there's certain things Swedes joke about, and that's like, for example, if you know where the cantarell mushrooms are in the woods, right, you can go into the woods and pick the mushrooms. It's one of the kind of like things that we do in Sweden. You go and pick mushrooms or berries or strawberries. But the knowledge of where the best places are for those mushrooms, you own that and you protect that knowledge.
Really?
It's not often easily shared between people. It's kind of, there's jokes that you'd kill for the knowledge of where the best kind of mushroom patch is in the woods.
Now, is that a cultural kind of like ownership, or is that like illegal? Like, oh, I can sue you because you blabbed the location of
cultural.
Oh, okay.
It's like, I mean, you'd have to have a certain bond with the person who has the information or relationship in order for them to, trust you with the knowledge.
But bringing that to a digital context, that also happens then when people didn't realize they were sharing metadata when they're posting photos. So posting photos online of the mushroom place, and you didn't realize you had shared the GPS coordinates of the mushroom place. So things like that happened in the beginning. It was like, oh no, you gave it up.
Well, this is interesting to me because long before I started thinking about this aspect of ownership, I'd been thinking deeply about digital ownership, right? Like 10, 15 years ago, I was talking about things like, used MP3s, which was an actual concept people actually tried to sell. Just as, again, blowing your mind. It's like, wait, it's digital. You can't it's not a physical, And
then we got NFTs,
Well, yeah, and that's, so the root of my hatred for NFTs comes from already having explored that territory. Basically, I am not a big fan of artificial scarcity.
Yeah.
So literally just saying it's rare. Why? Because I said it, right? Really sort of, I find very grating. But that does get back to this notion of and I don't know, and I would love to learn more about this, what does intellectual ownership look like? Or lack thereof, right? So I'm starting to get my head around what does a lack of physical ownership look like, or a moderated physical ownership look like. But for intellectual property, which, in America, we absolutely would, if we could make the location of the strawberry intellectual property that I could buy or sell. I think part of that instinct to go full tilt on ownership is a capitalistic one. Because if I have complete ownership, okay, then I can charge for things. If I can charge for that person wanting to camp, okay, then let's do it that way, right? But yeah, because the mushroom thing is a voluntary cultural, hey, let's make this knowledge as scarce as possible for reasons. The flip side of that is the early days of MP3s and file sharing, where it was oh yeah, what are you talking about? It would be weird if looking at it from a cultural perspective. It would be weird for me not to share this with you because it's just information. It's not like a physical album. It's zeros and ones. It's just stuff, right? Why would I not share that with you? So it's interesting to me the types of intellectual property that we designate as meant to be. It's okay for it to be all wrapped up, and versus it's okay for just everybody should have access to it.
Right.
Yeah. And as well, me and Per are both self-employed consultants, and I know that both me and Per and this podcast, we license under a Creative Commons license. Which again is another aspect of this digital ownership. We're effectively giving away a lot of content without demanding payment in return and so on. And that's a whole argument about, should you do that? Should you protect your knowledge as a specialist, as an expert in your field? Why would you give all that knowledge away?
Yeah, and it's interesting too. I think Creative Commons is to intellectual property or copyright as the Swedish law about you own it, but you don't totally own it is to like property law,
Yes, exactly.
right? Because that's what it reminds me of. Because again, it's that notion of even the metaphor of the volume dial I took from when people were in the early days of Creative Commons was saying they were describing Creative Commons as putting a volume knob on copyright. So it's prior to that, it was you completely own the copyright and anybody else uses it at all, I can sue them, or anyone can use it anytime they want without any restrictions. It was saying, well, yeah, but what if you actually had some nuance and said, okay, you can use it, but you have to give me attribution, or you can use it, but you can't make money off of it. I mean, in a weird way, and I hate to give it credit, but that is kind of what some of the promise of cryptocurrency, not just the dollars and cents version of it, but the blockchain version of smart contracts, right? I can literally make it a part of the DNA of this piece of content, how you can use it and why and all of that stuff. Like that is, I think, one potential good use, not one anyone's using, but one potential good use of that kind of technology. But yeah, I'm a big fan now of trying to get outside of the binary. And ironically, I think technology is better suited for this, right? But we haven't used it that way. We've used it in technology in a very binary way, when in fact, technology, because you can get to this very granular level with content, with whatever it is, you could actually be very subtle. Things like Creative Commons, I think, I don't think it's a coincidence that Creative Commons came about post-web, because the opportunity for it was there. Like legally, you could have had those contracts going back since there was copyright. But it became of age when the digital realm entered. And I suspect that's because there was a lot more potential for subtlety and opportunity to say, oh, anybody can get access to this content. And is it really worth it creating a basically artificial wall to it, even though at the end of the day, it is zeros and ones. If someone buys it, there's no more or less of it in the world. Like, I wonder if that's how that occurred.
And also you've got the whole thing with digital artifacts is, because they're zeros and ones, they're so easily replicated.
Yeah.
Whereas in the physical world,
exactly.
Creative Commons is maybe, I can see why it'd be later coming in the pure physical world, in that, there's only so many tables, and it's going to take you effort and time and real material to create another one, even if it's identical.
Well, there's a service industry aspect to it. It's like there's a certain amount of effort I have to go into to make another one. So the best example, I learned this from Clay Shirky, and I think he learned it from the Why We Cooperate novel. But basically, if you think about like music sharing, if I have a vinyl album and you want to listen to it, I don't have it anymore. I have to give it to you. So that's sharing of objects.
And every time it's played, it's worn slightly.
Yes, that's true.
So
it's
you've
exactly
appreciated.
Exactly right.
It's lifetime.
Now, if I want to make you a mixtape, okay, I can give you the mixtape, and I still have all the music I used to make the mixtape, but there's effort involved. I have to like go through and like actually do it. So that's a sharing of effort. If I make a playlist on Spotify, come on, right? What have I done? There's no effort involved. All I am sharing is knowledge, right? If I share an MP3 with you, like I still have the MP3, now you have the MP3, they're both perfect. They're literally the same object. That's sharing of information, which gets back to why it seemed weird to restrict the sharing of information, whereas it seemed to make some kind of sense to say, okay, there's effort involved in making that new table, making that new vinyl record, whatever. So yeah, it's been interesting to see that evolve.
And now we're actually accepting all over the world digital rights management. We're buying books, we're buying music that we aren't allowed to share, that we aren't allowed to copy. And it started already with the CDs and DVDs. Sure, you could copy them, but you weren't allowed to.
Yeah.
And now you can't even lend a person a book. There are like systems they put in place. Like if you want to lend a book on Amazon, a Kindle book, you can only do that like a limited number of times, and then it's done. Now you can't share it anymore with anyone.
Well, it's become like software, right? We went from the sort of more artifact model of, like I said, it's a book. If I have that book, I can share that book with you. I can't use it while you're, well, that stuff. To, I think, a guy who wrote Darknets, I'm blanking on his name right now, but the metaphor he used, which I thought was perfect, is we're moving into a world where if you want to pull a book off your shelf, you have to pay first. Right? Like, it isn't really yours. Getting back to that notion of ownership, like,
it's never yours.
That copy of, so I'll give you a perfect example. I got a digital copy of this one Ray Charles song, Just Because. Plays at the end of the movie The Sure Thing for you 80s movie fans out there. Very hard to find, but I found it. Got it on Amazon Music, and it was in my library. It was actually on my computer. I had the MP3 download of it. At some point, my hard drive was compromised and I lost all of the music on it. But hey, that's the beauty of the internet age. I can just re-download all of it. So I did that, and guess what? Just Because was no longer there. So I went and looked, and it was no longer available. So I owned it. I paid for it. And effectively, Amazon took it back when it came time for them to no longer have the right to sell it. So that would be this example of, like, I have a book on my shelf, and then I wake up in the morning and suddenly that book's not there anymore. It's like, did I ever really own it then? No. The company who made it owned it. They just licensed it to me.
So the buy button is misleading because you're not buying it.
No, it's a rent button.
Exactly.
It's a rent until we say otherwise button.
You enter into a specific contract button.
I can't tell you how many times across my lifetime I've bought the movie Top Gun, thinking I still have it, but I don't know if I do have it anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I think I've got it on DVD. Is that owning it nowadays?
Well,
Probably it's a physical thing, isn't it? We've digital stuff on a physical thing.
But when that deteriorates over time.
Hasn't yet.
No. You're not allowed to do a copy of it, though.
But you can.
You can,
I'm
but you're not allowed to.
I'm staying quiet. So the whole digital economy, when it comes to digital artifacts, it's based on artificial scarcity.
Yes.
It can't, just by its pure definition, it can't be based on anything else other than artificial scarcity.
And this is a conversation. So I did a talk called A Million Medicis at South by Southwest in 20-something. And like 20 years ago at least. And I was basically talking about that conundrum. And where I landed was, my hypothesis was that we value things, we pay for things based on how we think about them. And so I think about that physical album or that table as, someone put effort into that, they made it, it is scarce. So I'm going to pay for the thing that's scarce. I'm going to pay more for the thing the more scarce it is. Oh, it's a diamond table. Okay, that's super rare. Okay, I'll pay a lot for that. When something is zeros and ones, and I know it's zeros and ones, and I know that it is basically infinitely replicable, I have a really hard time paying for that. It's like, no, it's just like water. It's just infinite. There is literally no scarcity there. So I have to invent scarcity. I have to make an iTunes quote unquote store that has all these objects in it that have these album covers that look like physical rare things. But no, the second I download that, there is no more or less of it in the world. So I started thinking about, okay, what is scarce in that scenario? And what's scarce in buying that, Beyonce digital album is Beyonce. She's the part that is, in fact, individual, not replicable, super scarce, her time, her effort. Yeah. So I started thinking, no. Are you thinking about like digital personas or something?
AI.
Oh, AI. Yeah. Well, so we'll come back to AI. But so her, that human being is scarce. So then I should actually be paying her. And that's where I started thinking about, and at the time it was new and now it's pretty normal, but I started thinking about crowdsourced patronage. So things like Patreon, which was like a newborn baby at that point. But I was sort of saying, okay, this is the future, or this is a future that makes sense with how we think about scarcity, right? I want to give the money to Beyonce because my bet is if she has enough money to just live her life and create and not like work in a Starbucks or something, I will then as a result get more art in the world that I want rather than just pay for the art. So it's been interesting to see that line mature as well, because at least for me, from a scarcity standpoint, that's real scarcity, not artificial scarcity.
Love that.
And also, this makes me think, of course, the whole thing of commons is there's normally a mutually beneficial aspect to these things. I mean, Per can camp in my back garden, and I can camp in his.
That's true, yeah.
And same as if I tell you where the mushrooms are, you'll tell me where the strawberries are.
Yeah.
It's almost down. It's commons. It's common knowledge. It's shared common knowledge. It's mutual beneficial. Whereas that gets much more difficult when you're stretching the scale.
Yeah.
And how much, if we had a mutually beneficial relationship with Beyonce,
right?
How is that balanced in the scale of things?
Yeah. Well, look, if Beyonce wants to camp on my property, that's
I'll
fine.
do that.
And if I want to camp on her property, if I want to make that arrangement, I'm fine with that.
And she can camp 2 nights on my property, and I can have tickets to her concert exchange.
Exactly.
That sounds fair.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, what you're talking about, though, is like the sort of industrialization of that, right? Because, Beyonce is a artist at an industrial level where like there's masses and masses. She is a one to many, 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 many kind of relationship. But again, like I kind of like tried to think about this at the time was the notion of financial risk right? So if Disney pays $250 million to make an Avengers movie, they are putting up the financial risk, right? And if that movie's a flop, they're out $250 million. I have no stake in that, right? They make it, I can pay, but since they're assuming all that risk, absolutely they can decide how much a ticket costs. They can decide who's in the movie, who's not. They can decide what the digital rights are around it, right? You've put up that much money, fine, that makes sense to me. What gets interesting is where you have a crowdfunded model where it's like, well, we commonly put up the money. Like if you were able to get enough of us together to raise $250 million, we decided that was going to happen. And now we actually kind of have a say in like what kind of like digital rights are involved and how much the ticket should cost, or should there even be a ticket because I already paid, right? Like it really warps how we think about the transactional nature. And which is the other interesting aspect of it is those crowdfunded kind of scenarios tend to be as much about love and fandom as they are about a transactional thing. Like I funded the Veronica Mars Kickstarter.
Oh, I did as well.
And I don't know about you, I didn't do it because I was like, okay, I want exactly one T-shirt and one Blu-ray copy out of this transaction. I was like, no, I freaking love Veronica Mars. I want there to be more of it in the world. Even if the movie sucks, I don't care. I want to be part of this thing that I love. That was the motivation.
It wasn't a rational economic transaction. That was an emotionally charged economic decision.
And
we're never rational.
Well, that's the thing. Like, I think there's something more honest about that because it's saying it's skipping over the I'm being a rational human whatever. No, I am an emotional person. I'm making an emotional purchasing decision because guess what? They all are.
And it makes me feel good because you're describing it now, and I can see the passion because you feel wonderful about it.
Well, that's on an individual level. Yes, they're all emotional decisions. I mean, the rationality comes in at scale, arguably.
But to get, it's interesting. You bring up the AI thing. I literally 2 hours ago, I was at the Swedish Museum or the Stockholm Museum of Modern Art, and there was a Laurie Anderson exhibit, which was fascinating. If any y'all are anywhere in the area, I highly recommend you go. But one of the first things you see is she tells a story that her, I think, father or grandfather told about his journey to America or something like that. And it's sort of like this total tall tale of like, oh yeah, I forgot my first job when I was 8. I was married by the time I was 10, like blah, 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 blah. And it's this just really very sort of when you're a kid, you kind of just accept this as a fact. But what she does is she has these photos, very sort of like old-timey looking photos on the wall of all those made-up incidents. And then when you get to the end, you look at this thing, it's like, oh, this was generated using one of those, generative AI. I think it was Midjourney. And I'm like, it's happened. We've gotten to the point where generative AI art is in a museum. Like that was a legit museum. Like the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm is a very, very real museum. Like it's got its bona fides. Like there's Warhol in there too. But yeah, and I'm like, oh, we've hit that point. But I know a lot of people would be utterly freaked out that generative AI in a modern art museum, clutching of pearls, But it's like, but it's Laurie Anderson doing it, so I'm like, okay, she I didn't realize that, but she's been doing stuff with all sorts of generative like machine learning stuff. She got there decades before anyone else, so she knows what's up. But she's using it, I think, in this very interesting way because what they did was they took those tall tales and then just prompted these sort of photoreal things out of it. And I'm like, that's a really interesting use of that thing. So in that case, if I was doing like a Kickstarter or whatever, like going back to this model of this collective reciprocal art relationship, that would be, hey, I'm going to keep contributing to the Laurie Anderson Patreon because she is doing interesting things. Like I don't owe the AI any money any more than I owe paintbrush money. I owe Laurie Anderson my money or whatever, however I want to express that gratitude because she is the generator, the actual generator of the art.
Interesting. But then going back to the ownership discussion, to build Midjourney, you had to have a lot of content online that you actually sourced that somebody else created. So you come back to this situation where people created something so that someone else can create something else that competes with the thing that you made that they took for free.
So my initial somewhat snarky reaction to that is That's art, baby. Because like what it reminds me of is early hip hop, right? Early hip hop used samples. They used, going back to vinyl, literal vinyl. They would go in, record dive, find these wonderful, like just little tiny slivers of music, like a drum loop, whatever, and just play it over and over and over and build the most amazing art out of it. Now, did they owe money to the, James Brown or whoever's thing they were lifting? Maybe. There's a great quote where Beastie Boys, Paul's Boutique, and Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet have between them literally hundreds of samples. And if you listen to hip-hop albums after that point, you'll find maybe 1 or 2 samples per album, because that's when digital rights management started to kick in. And if you were to try to make either of those 2 albums today, it would literally cost you something like $1 trillion with a T dollars because of all the samples they used. So it's like, okay, I get that. I guess you're compensating people, but gee, I sure would love another Paul's Boutique. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, it's the way the samples have been killed off like that is, is an interesting restraint, artificial restraint on creativity.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, even the great artists, I mean, going back with the different periods of art, there was also very much, talking to each other, sending letters to each other, working together, or having apprentices.
Inspired by someone.
You'd have, the main artist would be starting a picture off, and one of his students would finish it or work on it a bit. And there's so much spreading of or copying of what you do.
And I think an important distinction here is when Public Enemy is lifting James Brown is already okay. James Brown is not suffering at that point. A lot of the art, because generative AI lifts at scale. You don't even have to do the math to know that there are a large number of artists who are suffering, who probably could use that recognition, right? So there is, whenever you have these kind of discussions, you have to talk about power. And the power balance between, Beastie Boys and the theme from Jaws, and John Williams and the theme from Jaws, which they lifted for Eggman, that is a much more equal. If anything, the power balance is with John Williams in that one, right? Versus a generative AI thing that's pulling from 50 different people who are just creating fan art out of the love of it, and if we lived in a just world, would actually be getting thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars because they're really making these beautiful things. And the AI that is pulling from it to create, art for a Wired article, right? Like, okay, I feel like, Wired is doing better in that situation than the person. So I think it would be interesting to have some kind of, canonical way of basically ranking, sort of saying, okay, AI, you can pull from this because these people are fine. Like, pull whatever you want from Disney. They're fine. They're not going to suffer if I pull together a bunch of Disney images. But this person over here in Kansas who's like making, $22 an hour working at Home Depot, yeah, maybe not that person, right? That would be an interesting filter to put on your AI and say, do not exploit, click,
It's so interesting. Going back to Beyonce.
Sure.
So if we replicate her and start making music with her voice, and you don't realize it at first that it's not her, does that matter to you?
Oh, yeah. Let me tell you about the embarrassing story of the very first album I bought. So I went to a record store with my mother or my grandmother, I think it was, and on vinyl I bought this thing. It's like Olivia Newton-John's Greatest Hits, except what I didn't realize what it said was, sounds like Olivia Newton-John. And I got it home and I'm like, oh my God, what is this? And I was so embarrassed. More than anything, I was embarrassed that I had made this mistake, right? So yeah, I think that's a very big deal. And again, and here's where we get into the nuances of at least American copyright law, which is this notion of fair use, and specifically one clause that has to do with, is it transformative, right? So the example you're using, the less transformative it is, the more effective it is, because I don't know the difference. Right. Whereas with at least that piece of fair use law, I'd better be able to tell the difference. Otherwise, it's not transformative. Like, if you didn't transform it, then it's going to look the same. So I think there's a big difference between sampling Beyonce and adding her to some other collage you're making versus, no, really, we're going to make it sound exactly like her and tell the AI to make a song like she would make. Like, I think there's a little bit of a difference.
So pulling this all back into UX and design.
Oh, sure. But if you must.
So what becomes our responsibility as designers within this space?
Yeah.
Thinking about power, as you said, but also about making people aware and acknowledge what's going on, because there's so much going on now that we aren't aware of.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lovely thing on I was looking at Wikipedia entry for DJ Shadow's Introducing, which is just a classic electronica, like just album. And at the end of it, it's like for every song, they show you what's sampled. Like, because it was funny too, because I was listening to a piece of like, wait, is that from that John Carpenter movie? Oh my God. And I will, yeah, it is. Oh my God. I got that, you know. And again, John Carpenter is going to be fine. But I think it is very important from a content perspective to be transparent and say, just like that little button I can click that shows me the source code on any web page I go to, it is important that I be able to see, like, show your work, right? These are the different things that I used. Or if I go to an art museum and I see a work, it'll say all the materials that were used. This is like, you know, oil on this canvas with these elements involved, blah, 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 blah. I think it is in right relationship to the other artists that you relied on to create your work, to show your work and say these are the, and as much detail as makes sense, these are the artists that I'm lifting from here, that have influenced me, that are either directly or indirectly like recognized here. And so that's from a content perspective, and like, what do you want to reveal to the user? From a UX perspective, like, I'm not joking. When you're building that AI, start thinking about the filters you can use to differentiate for power. Like, participatory design and other sort of more modern forms of design are thinking very much about power in the design framework. And like, when is my research being exploitative? When is my design approach being exploitative, right? So are there things that I can build into the product itself or into the tool itself that account for that, or at least attempt to account for that? So yeah, I would love to sort of have that kind of, you know, AI exercise of saying, I was actually joking with my friend about this the other day, like how many AI tools, when they're trying to create a norm, are basically just pulling from a bunch of white people. Because when it looks at the web, that's most of what it's going to see, because the web was built by a bunch of white people and there's therefore populated by a bunch. So I was saying, like, can we create an AI that is effectively creating, you know, the black internet or the oppressed internet? Like, it's only pull from examples of people. Like, if you really want to be blunt, don't put any white people in the sample, right? But pull from people who are the targets of oppression and see what kind of results you get then, because that would be very interesting, right? I think you'd start to see a very different picture. I think the closest we have to this now is when I do look at people who are the targets of oppression or who are artists, and I'm finding that they're doing the most interesting things with tools like generative AI. So I have a friend, Rashid, who's doing this amazing work creating, like, you know, Stevie Wonder action figures and all this stuff using Midjourney. It's just amazing, you know. Or like I just said, Laurie Anderson, who is clearly coming at this from a social justice lens and is thinking about things like, there's an incredible piece, a number of pieces she's done around a person who at 14 was sent to Guantanamo Bay after 9/11. Like, these really horrific stories that if you just let an AI loose would never find, but because she is coming from a very particular point of view, she's able to use these tools for very particular ends. I forget what the question was, but that's where we got. the UX piece. So yes. I want Laurie Anderson's UX mind when we're building these things, right? I want my friend Rashid's mind when we're building the UX part of this.
But it's really be intentful.
Yeah.
Don't be lazy. Yeah. Don't just swallow everything. Just make sure that you know where you want to go.
And do it for a reason other than just making money. Like, just to bring back to ownership, it's like, do it for a reason that's thinking more about the commons and thinking more about reciprocity. I think reciprocity, I think, is a fantastic UX lens that we just never use. Just to give you a small example, Sadie Red Wing did a podcast with, I'm blanking on his name, but on inclusive design. And one of the things she talks, she's a Native American or indigenous designer, and one of the things she talks about is reciprocity as a concept in design. And so the example might be, let's say I'm designing the printing press. I might design that and say, oh, we just made our first book, yay, ship it, right, we're done. Whereas she would say, okay, yeah, but we made that book using what? Trees. Okay, well, let's plant a tree for every book we make. Now the design cycle is complete, right? So we never think giving back is not a step in the like build, measure, learn, iterative process. But wouldn't it be great if it were? Build, measure, learn, give back, build, measure, learn, give back. Like, that would be a really interesting step.
regeneration as the next step after sustainability.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I think that's how you get to sustainability. Like, if you don't plant another tree, you don't get any more trees, therefore no more books. You know?
Well, something we, well, not joke about, but we've discussed a fair few times, Per, just the whole speed at which the global internet has forced us to look upon the concepts of countries and those countries' laws and communities in a very different way. Because, you know, pre-internet, places were exotic.
Yeah.
You know, it was how they did it over there.
Yeah.
So on. There was lots of separation, for good or bad. But there was ways which meant you could keep diversive parts just slightly far enough away so they didn't clash.
Yeah.
Whereas the global internet has meant, wait, we've got a massive big pot of all it all at once, and we're staring it constantly and spitting stuff out of it, and shit's happening, and it doesn't always look good at the end of it all.
Well, it's interesting though, because I think that humans use tools the way humans are going to use tools. Because I was sitting out, looking out at Stockholm and thinking about recent issues around immigration. That not just y'all, but everyone is facing, and how immigration is basically driving a lot of people to the far conservative right and just getting literal Nazis or ex-Nazis into power. And part of my mind was just, oh my God, borders are silly. Borders, well, like, what's the point? Borders are so... Can you find me a good user story for a border that isn't, like, really racist, right? And that thing with the internet really breaking that down, like, I think it's gone in both directions. It's, on the one hand, it is introducing people to ideas about how people do it in other places. Although what I found is I need to physically go there for that to really hit home. Right? I had a vague, so I just came back from Japan. They do it different in Japan. They do it in this very powerful collectivist, let's actually try being nice to each other kind of way that blows my mind. Like, I can read about it, but being there and in it is totally different. But what's weird is because humans use tools the way they want to use them, the internet has been used as well to create and manifest and like just cycle these stories about, oh, immigrants are dangerous, right? Which, if you've ever met one or spent time with one, odds are you are going to find that, no, they're just like me. Like, they have different cultures maybe, but like me, they want to have a safety and maybe a family and maybe food, right? If I rely on the internet for that experience, what I am as likely to get, for a number of reasons, is stories that are more fear-mongering. So in a weird way, the internet made borders worse. I don't know how it pulled it off, but because it wasn't the internet, it was us. But we found a way to use the internet, which is borderless, to make borders worse. So humans, man, I don't know.
Really, we created a digital thing disconnected from the physical thing, and that didn't fully reflect the physical thing.
Yeah.
And you need to go to cultures to experience them, like say in Japan and so on.
That one feels like a to be continued for solving.
Sorry. You do not want to, like, the name of my podcast should be Don't Get Me Started. Like, that's...
Thank you so much, David. There was loads of fun.
Yeah.
I have to say, what I really, really appreciate about how David frames all his topics, whatever he's talking about, really. He's so curious. So he's just pulling information from all these different topic areas and applying a systems thinking perspective. For me, he is one of those designers who is constantly looking at design from a systems perspective. So he's seeing a fuller picture than the rest of us are, in a sense.
I wonder, too, whether his own rules of collaborative conversation, even though what we did now wasn't arguably a collaborative conversation, not in the traditional sense of that, but his 3 rules, which he brought up in his talk at From Business to Buttons, they're just in his mind all the time. I mean, okay, and now I've mentioned them again, I've got to say what they are. Neither of us have the answer. Neither of us will win. And we are here to create something new.
And that's just a wonderful way to approach any conversation, really.
Yeah, and I think that's what you mean. Looking back, I know the systems thinking aspect you mentioned there as well, but looking back at our conversation, he clearly has these deep-rooted in his way of handling conversations.
And for someone who's written a book about cognitive bias, of course, he's trying to eliminate bias in in every way he can. So that's essentially what he's doing. And he's even admitting to us about his bias about ownership in the beginning of the interview and saying that, well, now he was curious and now he's learning about, well, there are different ways to look at ownership.
Yeah. Fascinating. Again, about ownership, something else that I've been thinking about in reflection after listening back to our interview with David is ownership versus availability. Now, in our chat, we do talk about the temporary nature of a lot of our ownership, that we're leasing, we're renting, we're borrowing things rather than actually owning them in the digital space. But it made me think about how sometimes what's more important than the ownership is availability. That there are some things that we would balance, so there'd be a balance there, and we'd prioritize just having something possible to get hold of rather than saying it's mine.
Right.
And I suppose I think with streaming music, anyway, for me, I can see that there's something very attractive about having all the world's music instantly available for me to listen to if I fancy listening to it. And that's a different thing to me actually owning a set of records that are mine. That's an emotional thing. It's a physical thing. But the availability is very attractive in itself.
Exactly. So what you just said there made me think of, yes, I can feel something when I pick up a CD case and I have the artwork. I feel something emotionally because I bought it at a specific time and place, probably, and I've listened to it in specific places as well. So it triggers something, but I'm not triggered in the same way by scrolling down like a playlist in Spotify.
No, exactly, and so the availability too. Another example would be, if I owned a street light that was, I put a street light on the edge of my property to shine on the edge of my drive, and then that's gonna leak light onto the road next to it and even the properties next to it.
Yes.
I don't need to own that street light, really. I mean, what's most important there is that I have light available to me. This is why we end up with government provided lighting or council provided lighting, whatever, municipal lighting, because the availability and the common good aspect, the availability is much more important than the ownership. We don't need to own street lights.
But you want influence. You want influence over if there are street lights or not. So
possibly, but ultimately, if something's absolutely available, as in to its absolute extreme, then there will always be street lighting in every place that you would ever need lighting to it.
But now we can get into light pollution in some places that don't want it. So it's still going to be complicated.
Pulling back into the digital side of things, then I mean the ultimate music streaming platform would be one streaming platform, because if there's multiple platforms, that reduces availability, because then you'd have to work out which platform something is available on. So you'd have one global platform with no fees.
With no fees for anyone.
No fees for anyone, because it's always available, and everyone was happy with this platform. You see, I mean, we're laughing already because we understand the ridiculousness of some of these things, because
at the same time, we're joking about sometimes how artists don't get paid when they are on Spotify. And David was alluding to this, of course, when he was talking about you pay the maker, the Patreon type services.
Yeah.
What you want to pay for is for someone to keep making the stuff, not perhaps paying for the stuff they already made, but you want them to keep doing things.
Exactly. You want to keep, like we alluded to, keep their time available for being creative.
Yeah.
But then we do get into the whole, as David did too, the capitalist side of it, or the kind of the desire to earn more shiny things, or more money, or whatever you want to, whatever drives you, and you get past the point maybe where you have received enough to free up your time, and you start getting to wealth accumulation. And this could easily get very political now per this discussion.
Yeah, well, it could really. But it also ties into what I brought up in the intro what he said towards the end about build, measure, learn, and give back. So, if we bring it into design perspective of actually realizing how much what you are designing is costing in terms of social values and social effort and environmental costs, then there are so many ways in which you can also make sure that your efforts are paid back into all those costs.
Yeah. And I think you can, as a designer, help influence that ownership versus availability balance as well. We don't have to implement DRM in a way which stops you from having some long-term ownership.
Exactly.
But you can also make things available. So there's a balance, and I think we can.
As people are realizing that they don't own anything anymore, I think as people become aware, so with increased awareness, there will be new business models that actually accommodate these different types of ownership.
Yeah, new business models, but also new solutions, which aren't necessarily business models.
Very nice, exactly.
This year, we are actually going to be at From Business to Buttons again.
Yay! In May.
Yep, and we will be recording more interviews with this year's speakers and guests at From Business to Buttons here in Stockholm.
On May 24th is when it's happening. And speakers have been announced, workshops have been announced. I'm going to start reading from the webpage here. We've got Jason Massoud, we've got Arathi Krishnan, we've got Christina Joy Whitaker, we've got Lou Down, Cheryl Kababa, and Chris Nossel. Some of those people you've noticed we have interviewed on this podcast before.
And if you want me and Per part of your next conference, event, or in-house training, then you can just get in touch and have a little chat to us about it and see if we can arrange something.
Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side. Per, why can't rappers take holidays?
I don't know, James. Why can't rappers take holidays?
They always forget to pack. You see, you don't know anything about music.
I don't get it.
No, you see, if you knew anything about, if you had some knowledge about music, you'd understand.
Yeah, okay.
Tupac.
So it has to do with rapping the music and packing something, which has another meaning, I guess.
It's a rap artist, Tupac.
Oh, they forget Tupac. Oh,
you see, Tupac is a rap artist.
Well, yes, that I know. Actually,
they forget Tupac. So I shouldn't have to explain.